I think we all know stories about people who fell into pits, and you may have experienced moments in your life in which you were the one who fell into the pit. The crucial question is, though, who helped you out? Did you climb out alone, or did someone help you? And when you may have seen others stuck in pits, did you do everything within your power to help them out? Did you call on others for help? Or did you simply ignore their plight, expecting them to get out the same way they got in? The reaction of people who stand around and are unable to get the fallen person out of the pit may be expressed in several ways. Did you hear the story about the old farmer who was devastated to find out that his donkey had fallen into a deep pit? Realizing he had no way to pull it out, he called his neighbors and said, "There's no saving the donkey. I'll have to give him up, but at least help me fill the pit so that no other animal falls in." The neighbors, wanting to help, began tossing clumps of earth into the pit. At first the donkey protested loudly, but after a while he fell silent, so the curious people on top peered inside to find out why. To their amazement, the donkey had been shaking off each clod of earth and stepping up onto it. Little by little, the rising ground lifted him until he finally climbed out of the pit. And there's another tale about a frog. A number of frogs fell into a deep pit and couldn't jump out of it. Some other frogs who were on the top of the pit weren't very friendly, but practical as they were, shouted at the frogs inside and told them that they shouldn't even try to jump out because they wouldn't succeed anyway. At first they tossed in a little bit of food, but soon enough they gave up, convinced the frogs inside were doomed, and as expected, most of those who fell inside eventually died of hunger and thirst. Most, that is, except for one frog who kept jumping and trying to get as high as possible until it finally managed to jump out of the hole. And when the frogs on top asked him how was it possible that he was the only one who had been able to jump out, he signaled to them in sign language that he didn't understand what they were saying because he was deaf and couldn't hear. Because of this, he never stopped trying. In both stories, the friends on top of the pit eventually gave up on helping those stuck inside. And in both stories, the animals got out on their own. The donkey by using common sense, and the frog because of his weakness, his deafness, which kept him from hearing all of the discouraging voices. These stories remind us that sometimes the way out of a pit may come from the person who fell in, or sometimes even from something that seems like a flaw. As the saying goes, there are many ways in which Hashem can save a person, or even an animal, for that matter. In the Parsha we read that Yosef's brother threw him into a pit because they considered him a rodef, a pursuer, according to Torah. They believed he was trying to claim that he was the only heir to Yaakov and was planning to remove them in the same way Esau and Ishmael were removed from the Jewish dynasty earlier. Yosef's brothers were also angered by the slander he had told their father about them, which, according to their knowledge of Torah, was not justified. And they were also irritated by his grand dreams indicating he would rule over them. Yosef was not only accused by his brothers, many commentators also suggest that he himself was responsible for his sale to the Gentiles, because his actions and dreams stirred jealousy, hostility, and hatred towards himself. At first, the only one who attempted to save Yosef was the eldest son, Reuven, who actually suggested that he be thrown into the pit instead of having him killed. And his intention was to come back later to rescue him. However, this didn't take place, and even the sons of Bilha and Zilpah, whom Yosef had befriended, didn't try to assist him. This is likely because they respected and feared their older brothers, whose decisions were dominant and carried out by all of them as a rule. According to some opinions, the brothers even thought that if their father favored Yosef so greatly, they could test his righteousness by seeing whether Hashem would save him if they threw him into a dangerous pit. They reasoned that if he survived, it would be a sign that Hashem is protecting him. Little did they know that although they were the ones to pull him out, he not only survived but attained a powerful position eventually. But I want to explore something else in the Parsha about the pit. It says that when Yosef was thrown in the pit was empty, there was no water in it. Rashi adds that even though there was no water, there were snakes and scorpions in it. On this, the Gemara comments, there was no water in it, but there were snakes and scorpions in it. Immediately afterwards, the Gemara goes on, there is no water, meaning there was no Torah. Symbolically, we learn from here that Yaakov's pit was emptied and there was no water in it, meaning there were no words of Torah that are likened to water. The connections of these two statements suggest that if there is no water in the pit, that is, if there is no Torah dominant in a person's life, negative forces, likened to snakes and scorpions, are most likely to take over his life. But how can we say these things about Yaakov's sons? After all, they relied on their knowledge of Torah to define him as a rodef, a pursuer, who they believed wanted to harm them. Therefore, he deserved to be put to death. It was only out of mercy that they lowered him into the pit instead of killing him, because after all, he was their brother. It's worth noting that they didn't ask their father's permission to get rid of Yosef. They believed that Yaakov's love and favoritism for Yosef blinded him to any of his faults, while they feared that Yosef was acting wrongly and needed to be removed from the family, even if their father would never see it that way. They compared the situation to that of Yitzchak, who had preferred Esav and wanted to bless him, even though Esav was wicked and involved in horrible acts. And because of this, Rivka had to act cunningly to secure the blessings for Yaakov instead of Esav, who wasn't worthy of them. And if it's true that they acted at least outwardly according to the Torah, why do our rabbis say that they lowered him into a pit where Yaakov's pit was emptied, meaning that it was empty of Torah? The reference is to his sons who, according to this, had abandoned the true way of Torah in their actions, while for fact they relied on their knowledge of Torah in making this decision. In order to understand this, we ought first to ask, why is the Torah compared to water? And the answer is, just as water flows from a high place to a low place, so the words of Torah reach only someone who is humble. In other words, while one must understand what one is learning, one should always remember that the purpose of Torah is to permeate and transform a person from within. It's known that when studying any subject, a person understands it better the more he remains objective and does not let his personality or preferences interfere. The more he sets himself aside, the more he is able to see clearly and arrive at the right conclusions. In Torah study, beyond the benefit of setting aside the self to understand any subject, we must remember that the Torah is Hashem's Torah. It has spiritual and subtle depths that are difficult to grasp with the intellect alone. Therefore, in studying Torah, one must be even more objective and humble, striving to understand its depth without letting oneself get in the way. Often, when people explain something, we find them saying, I, for example, but what difference does it make whether it's about them or not? What matters is the understanding of what is written. Therefore, the I must be set aside when learning Torah. We must remember that in studying Torah, we are trying to grasp ideas far beyond our understanding, so much so that it is compared to putting an elephant through the eye of a needle. Of course, this is impossible for us to fully imagine, but this analogy helps us to see that we barely scratch the surface of Torah concepts, and there is far more in the words of the Torah than we can perceive. This is also why we mention in our prayers first, and my soul will be like dust to all, and only then will my heart be open to your Torah. In regard to Torah study, it is interesting that according to the Jewish law, merely thinking about the words of Torah is not considered full study. Contemplation alone is not enough. If a person does not actually speak the words, he doesn't fulfill the commandment, and you shall learn them. Internalizing the Torah is connected to speaking it. As our sages say, they are the essence of our lives for those who articulate them with their mouth. But even speaking is not enough. The sages add, if the Torah is settled in all of your limbs, it is preserved. If not, it's not preserved. When the Vilner Gaon was very ill, in those days the doctors did not yet use stethoscopes. So a visiting Jewish doctor crouched over his chest to listen to his heartbeat. When another doctor in the room asked, how is he doing? Where is he holding? The first doctor replied, he is holding by the tractate of Kelim, Masechet Kelim. In other words, the Torah was so deeply internalized in him that it was present in his very limbs. When I choose a Torah lecture to listen to, I first observe the speaker and try to judge him by his appearance or demeanor. Jokingly, may I add, if it's a woman who does not show her face, this indicates that she's exceedingly modest, which gives her some positive points. And I ask, does he seem God-fearing? Does he seem like someone who observed the mitzvahs diligently? If I'm in question, I search and read up about him or her, or listen to part of the lecture and get the feel of things. Is he or she reflecting authentic Judaism, or is it watered down with foreign ideas? He may be a great scholar, but if the Torah is not truly internalized in him, and he does not feel a connection to Hashem through his study, there is little to learn from him. The key to accepting the words of Torah is humility and setting aside one's physical and selfish desires. Only then can a person truly be worthy of teaching Torah. The reason for this is that the purpose of Torah is to draw closer to the giver of the Torah. Thus, while one should strive to understand what he studies, he must also recognize that he is trying to grasp the wisdom of the Almighty. Just as the body's limbs cannot comprehend an idea, the human mind too is limited in conceiving the divine. Even if you attain some measure of understanding, higher levels always remain beyond you. Therefore, by humbling oneself before studying, a person acknowledges that his mind may be as limited as his other limbs in apprehending the depth of Torah. On the other hand, Torah is so powerful that when a person cultivates this realization, meaning the truth about its endless dimensions, he embraces Torah fully and totally with all his limbs, since by acquiring this awareness, his mind and his limbs succumb equally to the divinity of the Torah. Uttering the verses and phrases of Torah not only deepens one's understanding, but also shows that a person has truly grasped the subject. Since, for example, by explaining it to others, he further strengthens his own knowledge of whatever he had just explained. The more effort, both mental and physical, a person invests in Torah study, the more he rises above his physical limitations and strengthens his spirituality, because the words of Torah connect him to the infinite. In the same spirit, when the Rebbe of Gur was a child and was once asked, "Where is the Creator?" he replied, "He exists everywhere he is welcome." Although the infinite cannot fully enter the limited human brain, the willingness to be humble makes a person a vessel for this light. This humility also influences the rest of his body, making it receptive to the light of the Torah. To translate this realization into practice, the more we speak aloud when we study, the more we understand and internalize it. The Gemara tells of a student who studied quietly, whispering the words instead of saying them out loud. As a result, he forgot his studies. Why? Because his soul was not properly prepared. He had not spoken the words out loud. Supposing you enter a city library where silence is the rule. You may see wise people, book lovers, and even geniuses quietly absorbing book after book. Yet even before you enter a yeshiva hall, you'll hear the sound of Torah from afar, sometimes very loud. The difference is that the yeshiva students learn with energy and enthusiasm. Why? Because they experience Kehem Chayenu, that Torah is our life. And here's another way to illustrate the impact of engaging additional senses in study as a catalyst for deeper understanding. Some of us may recall that years ago arithmetic was taught to children using charts and at the most drawings on the blackboard. This was the norm in most schools until they began teaching with the help of Cuisenaire rods and similar objects, which helped the children understand the material more effectively by engaging with physical objects. According to these examples and explanations, we can try to understand the rabbi's statement that there is no water in the pit, but there were snakes and scorpions in it in connection with the emptying of Yaakov's pit. Yosef's brothers did not fail in their Torah study. They believed that according to Torah law, Yosef deserved the death penalty, which they later chose to mitigate by selling him instead. However, they lacked the humility necessary as a prerequisite for Torah study, considering their potential spiritual level. In other words, had they cultivated this humility before concluding that Yosef deserved death according to Torah law, they would have judged him differently, much more leniently. In a way, they could have spared him suffering and spared their father 22 years of unbearable grief. Yet in fact, Yaakov's pit was empty of water, with water alluding to Torah. This refers to his son's failure to reach a proper verdict, since they lack the connection to Torah on the higher level expected of them. As a result, the pit contained snakes and scorpions, representing the negative outcomes of their decision. And here's another lesson symbolized by a pit. Sometimes we fall into a pit of negativity, or we may bear responsibility for someone else who had fallen. In such cases, it's easy to blame ourselves and dwell on our mistakes, sinking into brooding over negative thoughts and memories. Yet we must remember that everything is ultimately determined from above, according to Hashem's plan, which we may not always understand. Occasionally, however, we are fortunate enough to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Following this last conclusion, we can also find a positive dimension in the act of lowering Yosef into the pit, which ultimately led to his sale to Egypt, despite the negative aspects mentioned above. Once the brothers took control of Yosef and sold him, it was as if he had already become their slave even before entering the Egyptian servitude. And even after Yosef rose to power and became the ruler of Egypt, he still remained, in a certain sense, slaves of his brothers. Since they were considered the masters of the one who governed Egypt, the Jewish bondage to the Egyptians was not absolute, because in a sense they ruled over the ruler of Egypt. Following this logic, since their status in Egypt was not considered complete slavery, this made it possible for them to eventually leave, unlike the rest of Egypt's slaves who had no path to freedom. And I'll conclude with another story about a pit. A traveler once set out with a badly drawn map trying to reach a tourist spot long before the days of Google Maps. As he followed the map, he suddenly lost his footing and fell straight into a deep hole. Shocked and shaken, he tried again and again to climb out the same way he fell in, but the walls were too steep, and each attempt pushed him back down. Exhausted and hopeless, he finally looked around, and then he saw it. On the far side of the pit was a gentle slope, almost hidden, offering an easy way out. With one careful climb, he walked right out of the pit that had trapped him moments before. So even if we fall into a pit, then if it is a spiritual pit, we'll know that the way out is through the Torah. But even if it's a physical or emotional stumble, we should expand our minds and perhaps look for a more convenient way than the one we entered it. After all, no matter the type of pit we fall into, we still, hopefully, have the power of Torah that helps us creep out of it one way or another.